Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I see we have people filtering in nicely, so I think we can probably kick off, James. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. And hello, everyone. And on behalf of STOPAIDS and Global Health Advocates, I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of our new report series, Access Denied: What Happens When Big Pharma is in the Driving Seat. Thank you very much for taking the time to join today's discussion. My name is James Cole, and I am the Advocacy Manager at STOPAIDS. This report series, written by STOPAIDS and Global Health Advocates, with the support of journalist Priti Putnick and a legal researcher, explores how a lack of transparency in the pharmaceutical industry and the EU has harmed public health outcomes. I would like to thank the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for making this research possible. From the start of the pandemic, it was clear that COVID-19 was global and therefore demanded a global solution. Of course, the EU originally advocated for global solidarity in its pandemic response and for vaccines to be considered as global public goods. However, it largely abandoned its global solidarity approach, and a lack of transparency meant that it was difficult to assess whether the EU was failing to meet their global objective until it was too late. Lives were lost and variants emerged, but contractual secrecy and industry interests were preserved. 3 years on, today, the COVID-19 pandemic has officially caused the deaths of over 6 million people, disrupted global livelihoods, and continues to have a devastating impact on communities that don't have widespread access to health technologies. The pandemic has also re-emphasized the fundamental flaws in the global system for the research, development, and deployment of health technologies. As of June 2022, only 30% of WHO member states had reached the WHO's targets of 70% vaccine coverage. And increasingly, we know that pharmaceutical corporations wielded enormous power during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, how this power was exercised was often hidden from public view, with industry influence seeming to lead to some car crash decisions. Global Health Advocates and STOPAIDS conducted 2 analyses to understand what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. The reports that we're really excited to launch are structured in 2 parts. In the first part, we set the scene, speaking to key actors and stakeholders who are directly involved or following the contract negotiations. In the second report, we ran a legal review of the contracts. Within this, we investigated the clauses and redactions in contracts, which we argued undermined public health in the name of private interests. We investigated the influence also that pharmaceutical industry exerted on decision-making and outlined the consequences of these decisions. Together, the report's findings informed a series of recommendations that decision makers can today implement to increase transparency and protect public health and democratic spaces. Increasingly, it's clear that we must learn from the mistakes in the response to COVID-19 to both strengthen current efforts against COVID and other health threats, but also to be better prepared for the next pandemic. And today, we of course are hosting this discussion under the backdrop of the European Parliament's COVID Committee preparing its final report on the lessons learned and the recommendations for the future. And 2, the European Council is publishing soon its legislative proposal for the revision of the EU General Pharmaceuticals legislation. We hope the reports and today's discussion support these processes and the growing cross-sectoral calls for measures to ensure greater transparency, access, and accountability. I will shortly pass on to Teresa Bolden from Global Health Advocates and Molly Pugh-Jones from STOPAIDS to present on the reports, our findings, and our key recommendations. Following this, we were really excited to host a panel discussion chaired by Rowan Dunn from Global Health Advocates, with a panel of expert speakers which we're delighted to have joined us today. This includes MEP Marc Botenga, Dimitri Eynikel, EU Policy Officer at the MSF Access Campaign, and Dr Olga Gurgula, Senior Lecturer for Intellectual Property Law at Brunel University. Following this, there will then be an opportunity for questions on the reports and their recommendations. So without further ado, I'm now delighted to hand over to Tarita, who'll be presenting on the first report.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tarita Baldan, and I'm the EU Advocacy and Policy Officer at Global Health Advocates. For those who do not know us, GHA is a French nonprofit NGO advocating for policies and resources that effectively address health inequalities around the world. Today, I'll present to you Report 1, exploring the EU decision-making around the EU contracts negotiations. It gathers inside perspectives from 12 stakeholders involved in the process, including members of parliament, the commission, the negotiating team, industry representatives, and civil society, to name a few. It outlines the circumstances in which COVID vaccines negotiations took place and explores the level of influence Big Pharma had over EU decision-making. Report 1 sets the scene for Report 2, which is a legal review of the EU COVID-19 vaccine contracts, which my colleague Molly from STOPAIDS will present to you later. So a key consequence of the COVID pandemic has been the exacerbation of global systemic inequalities. Almost 3 years after the start of the pandemic, there's widespread consensus that the current system has failed to achieve equitable access for all. This inequality has increased infections, deaths, and spread of the new variants. We demonstrate in our reports that commercial, economic, and geopolitical considerations led the global response to COVID, rather than public health considerations. And although the EU made several statements on the importance of global solidarity, these statements were not turned into concrete actions. Instead, they were translated into an every country for itself attitude, which effectively led to a form of gatekeeping of COVID health technologies. A striking example of this inconsistency can be seen with the Access to COVID-19 Accelerator, the ACT-A. The EU was one of its founders and global leaders in supporting this initiative. And the ACT-A COVAX facility was created to act as a key purchasing agency for the whole world by pooling demand, shaping market, and ensuring equitable distribution of vaccines. But COVAX largely fell short in delivering this mandate, in part because rich countries pursue bilateral negotiations with vaccine producers instead of using COVAX self-financing arm for the purchase of vaccines as expected. And while COVAX faced problems purchasing vaccines, rich countries started to experience oversupply, so they started to announce donations to poor countries. But according to the People's Vaccine Alliance, by June 2022, less than half of the 2 billion vaccine doses promised were actually delivered. That happened because of two main reasons. First, the contracts signed, including those signed by the Commission, contain rigid clauses on how doses could be used and donated. And we will come back to this during the presentation of Report 2. And the second reason was because of liability. Even though doses could be donated, there were some liability issues. And pharma companies preferred transfer these liabilities to their customers, such as the EU. And these liabilities were then transferred to poorer countries when they were donated. And many poor countries were not able or willing to take on these liabilities. So in a nutshell, EU policy choices to protect the current system fueled global health inequalities between the global north and the global south, putting hundreds of millions of lives at risk. And these problems and consequences can be explained by three features that illustrate the relationship between the EU and the pharma industry. First is the imbalance of power, which leads to secrecy and to what some have termed as threats. The power held by Big Pharma is something that has long been acknowledged, and came at the front of the public discussions during the pandemic, as questions were raised on the influence private interests exercise on public decisions. Civil society has been raising concerns about the role of the power of pharma industry even before this pandemic. Their influence has increased ever since the Council issued a political recognition in 2016 that the current model of profits over people is problematic, and asked the Commission to review its system of incentives. And we're all looking forward to seeing the proposal for the revision of the basic pharmaceutical legislation, which should be out in mid-March, which was aiming to address this. And data shows that pharma lobby groups and companies, unlike civil society, has extensive access to EU decision-making during the pandemic. In fact, there were close to 100 meetings with the most senior Commission officials between January 2020 and September 2022. Not counting the informal communications and calls. In the first 2 years of the pandemic, Big Pharma dedicated over 30 million to EU lobby spending. There are also questions regarding the people composing the negotiating team and possible conflict of interest. In fact, a few negotiators for member states have been found to have close ties with the pharma industry, including the leading Swedish negotiator, Richard Bergström. Until 2016, he was leading the Pharma Trade Association, FPA, and he now has his own consultancy with clients such as VIPS and Pharma, the Swiss and America pharma lobby groups. Pharma members include Pfizer, Sanofi, and Johnson & Johnson. All of them have signed COVID contracts with the EU. So this does leave us to question the possibility of conflict of interest. And this imbalance of power is even more evident in the controversy surrounding the publication of vaccine contracts. The full contracts had not been made available. Only heavily redacted versions have been published by the Commission. It is worth noting that Pfizer, the EU biggest supplier with over 2 billion doses, has the most redacted contracts. It seems very likely that Pfizer had some control over these redactions. And this is quite concerning because we find ourselves in a situation where a corporate entity was able to dictate what a public institution such as the Commission could or could not disclose to the citizens whose interest it was meant to represent. My colleague Molly will elaborate more on the contracts and redactions later. And just last week, the SMS gate was making headlines again, with leaders of the COVID committee agreeing to ask President von der Leyen to appear publicly in front of the panel to explain her role in negotiating over text messages, the massive contract with Pfizer. Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla, on the other hand, has been invited twice to appear in front of the committee, but has refused. And neither the European Ombudsman or the European Court of Auditors have been able to obtain access to these important messages. Already in September 2020, several Freedom of Information requests were filed by CSOs and members of the Parliament to get access to information regarding the negotiations, including the agreed contracts. Corporate Europe Observatory shared with us that for the request that they sent to get access to contracts, they quickly received a response, which was negative, while for the request to access other documents related to the negotiations, the Commission didn't even reply. So this led them to submit a complaint to the European Ombudsman, which opened a negotiation that in turn led to the publication of heavily redacted contracts. But some Green MEPs were not satisfied and filed a complaint against the Commission to the European Court of Justice. After much back and forth, some members of Parliament finally were granted access to these unredacted contracts, but under very strict circumstances. They were in a secure room, they had no cell phone and no right to advisor, and only 30 minutes counting in the clock. It was only in November last year that the committee in charge of supervising and controlling EU budget, the CONT committee, received permission from DG Sante to review these agreements. And it has come to light that the pharma industry was also able to manipulate certain processes to its advantage, including the TRIPS negotiation. And despite being a leader in calling for global solidarity, the European Commission behind closed doors was actually blocking the TRIPS proposal, even though the European Parliament, a democratically elected body, had called on the Commission to support the TRIPS. Some stakeholders actually believe there is a connection between the EU's position on the TRIPS and the negotiation of the vaccine contracts. And that is that the EU would defend IP rights if it were able to secure vaccine doses for itself. If this claim was proved to be true, it would have serious consequences. But with so much secrecy surrounding these processes, it's really hard to know. An investigation published last year by Politico revealed that several member states, including Belgium, received threatening calls from pharma, warning them that if they supported the TRIPS proposal, pharma would reconsider local R&D investments. And just a few days ago, a story emerged about how BioNTech was pressuring Twitter to censor global health activists, criticizing them for not sharing vaccine technology with low-income countries. These reports examine key moments during the pandemic, and we conclude that the European Commission was in a position of weakness vis-à-vis the pharma industry. In an emergency situation, just like COVID, obtaining life-saving vaccines was the EU's #1 priority, and the industry saw a clear opportunity there. Commercial interests were protected at the expense of global vaccine equity. With an accountable driver, the public was taken for a ride. Thank you for your attention. I'll now give the floor to Molly from STOPAIDS, who will present to you report 2.
Thank you, Teresa. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Molly. I'm COVID-19 Advocacy Officer at STOPAIDS, which is a UK-based HIV health and human rights advocacy network. So I'm going to speak to the second report in the series, which is a legal review of the COVID-19 contracts that were agreed between the European Commission and pharmaceutical companies. And it's an analysis of the clauses and redactions that we consider to have undermined public health in the name of profit. And I'd just like to note that the report was written by STOPAIDS and Global Health Advocates with the support of a legal consultant. So if we go to the next slide, please. So first, to outline the contents of the report looks into the EU legal framework for information disclosure, focusing on provisions that are potentially relevant to COVID-19 vaccine contracts. It assesses how officials make decisions about redacting information, including on the basis of protecting commercial interests. Then the report reviews how the Commission redacted information during the COVID-19 pandemic, comparing the information contained in 3 redacted and unredacted vaccine contracts. And finally, the report analyses legal and policy tools that can be used to challenge contractual secrecy when it undermines public health. So if we go to the next slide, please. So to take a deep dive into some of the content of the report, we first felt that it was important to understand the legal frameworks that underpin how the EU deals with information. So under the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU institutions are required to conduct their work as openly as possible to promote good governance and ensure the participation of civil society. EU residents and citizens have a right of access to documents of the European Parliament, Council and Commission. Regulation 1049/2001 governs public access to Parliament, Council and Commission documents. Its purpose is to define disclosure principles and limits in such a way as to ensure the widest possible access to documents. The basic presumption is that all documents held by these institutions are public unless an exception applies. So exemptions that are potentially relevant to COVID-19 contracts include commercial interest, for which disclosure is prohibited if it would undermine the protection of commercial interests, including IP, intellectual property, unless there is an overriding public interest in disclosure. And decision-making interests, so the disclosure of documents containing opinions for internal use as part of deliberations and preliminary consultations within the institution concerned, which is prohibited even after the decision has been made if disclosure would seriously undermine the institution's decision-making process unless there is an overriding public interest in disclosure. So the report outlines these exemptions in greater detail. And for now, it's important just to note that what information gets disclosed is a decision that ultimately lies with the Commission. And to get an exemption, the Commission must first identify if the disclosure of documents would undermine one of these interests. And then they'd need to evidence how access to the document would actually undermine this interest. And lastly, they would need to determine whether or not there is an overriding public interest justifying the discourse. So lastly, once the Commission determines not to disclose documents in full or only redacted versions, individuals can challenge the Commission's decision by submitting a complaint to the European Ombudsman or to the Court of Justice of the European Union. So next, we considered how this framework applies in the context of COVID-19. Could we go to the next slide, please? Great, thank you. So during COVID-19, the Commission limited the release of COVID-19 contracts, minutes, and other documents. And in general, when they were made available, after consultation with vaccine manufacturers, these documents included the redaction of key information. In its response to an application requesting access to these documents, the Commission provided the two aforementioned justifications to limit disclosure of information. So that is to protect commercial interests and to protect the procurement process, including decision-making interests. However, in 2021, the Italian public broadcaster RAI published unredacted versions of 3 of the COVID-19 contracts. So this included the Commission's advanced purchase agreements with AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. The contracts provide a unique case study into the terms agreed to by the Commission during the COVID-19 crisis. Comparing the full contracts with redacted versions also helps to shine a light on the decision-making of the Commission when it comes to applying exceptions and redacting agreements. So we identified 7 major categories of redactions, which includes information associated with deliveries, prices, IP rights, product description, facilities and know-how, dose transfer, product safety, and legal frameworks. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the findings that we list in the report, but this is not an exhaustive list, and very much refer you back to that report for the full set of findings. So on deliveries, we found that redactions were maintained even for historical data, including deliveries that had already occurred, which would otherwise seem to lack commercial significance. Additionally, some information about the choices made by the Commission itself was redacted. For example, in the Pfizer and AstraZeneca contract, the fact that the doses provided to the Commission would be split pro rata was redacted, but the same information was not redacted in the Moderna contract, and it was not clear on what basis the Commission redacted this decision. Information about pricing was redacted across all 3 of the contracts, notably in contrast to the European Commission, the United States disclosed COVID-19 vaccine prices in all of its contracts. Information about IP rights was inconsistently redacted by the Commission. In the Pfizer contract, the Commission redacted that Pfizer held rights to the IP, but in the Moderna and AstraZeneca contracts, they disclosed that the companies retained the rights. Product characteristics, suppliers, and know-how were redacted in the Pfizer and Moderna contracts, and there were 3 notable redactions. First, the Commission kept secret the vaccine specifications, which contain important information about manufacturing requirements that could be helpful to other vaccine producers. Second, the Commission redacted information about Moderna's obligation to produce initial doses in European sites. And third, the dose used in the mRNA vaccines was kept secret, even though this was already public knowledge. And lastly, the Commission redacted information about how vaccine doses could be transferred, donated, and or resold in all 3 contracts. And these redactions were striking, in part because they concealed the Commission's own rights to the doses that it had purchased. And here, industry was concerned about liability issues that Teresa mentioned earlier. For instance, if the doses purchased by the EU were donated to a third country and an individual in that third country experienced adverse effects, who would be liable? So making these comparisons between contracts made clear that the Commission redacted a large volume of information that was relevant to public health. And it's important to consider why it is that they made decisions around the disclosure or reductions of these different information types, and what impact this had on the EU pandemic response and also on global health. So some key reflections in the report include that the Commission kept more information secret than other jurisdictions. For instance, pricing information was redacted by the Commission, but not by the United States. The Commission also withheld information that was not related to the reasons it used to justify secrecy. For example, ascertaining contractor obligations was difficult in the redacted contracts because details around dates and time periods were redacted, but it's unclear how this may have protected commercial interests or the procurement process. And it's also not clear on what basis information was kept secret about purely EU decisions, such as the decision to distribute doses on a pro rata basis. One of the most striking features of the redactions was their arbitrariness. Information that was not redacted in one contract was redacted in another, suggesting that the Commission was not necessarily making an independent, consistent judgments on whether certain categories of information met the exemption, and instead may have deferred to kind of preferences of the pharmaceutical companies. Lastly, across the three contracts analysed, the Pfizer contract was the most significantly redacted. And this is consistent with prior analysis that finds that Pfizer exercised its power to extract significant concessions from governments, including the Commission, and it is also consistent with the findings of our first report. So overall, given the lack of publicly available information, it's quite difficult to assess whether the Commission redacted more information on the pandemic contracts compared to other kinds of contracts. But it's clear that the public health emergency allowed pharmaceutical corporations to wield significant power over the last couple of years. And desperate for timely doses, governments may have agreed to terms that otherwise they wouldn't have, that may have been rejected or the subject of at least kind of longer negotiations, including demands for more secrecy. So in light of these findings and those of the other report, we developed a set of key recommendations, and I'm going to now hand back over to Tarita, who's going to outline these.
Thank you, Molly. So yes, as Molly was saying, the finding of both our reports have informed a series of recommendations that decision makers could implement to protect both public health and democratic spaces by increasing transparency, access, and accountability. So to ensure a key path to medical countermeasure for all, we have three recommendations. First, that the upcoming revision of the pharmaceutical legislation should create a more competitive environment, should remove unnecessary barriers to competition, and address abuses of the system and unfair practices. In particular, the EU should shorten regulatory protection periods. Second, when EU public funding is used to develop biomedical countermeasures, it must be accompanied by access conditions to guarantee the availability, affordability, and accessibility of medical products to all of those in need, including in low and middle income countries. And third, in the framework of the renewal of the EU Global Health Strategy, the EU and member states must take concrete steps to ensure that medical countermeasures are available, accessible, and affordable to all. And in order to increase transparency and avoid corporate capture of EU processes, we propose the following recommendations. That first, any future and preliminary negotiations that are held between the Commission and pharma companies before contracts are signed should be conducted in a fully open and transparency manner, using established processes rather than informal channels. Second, in any future official documents bearing redaction should list the specific exceptions under Article 4 of the Transparency Resolution for each individual redaction, rather than for the document as a whole. Third, the upcoming revision of the pharmaceutical legislation should include specific measures to guarantee transparency of R&D costs in its revised incentive framework, in line with the WTO recommendation. This lack of transparency has been acknowledged by the Commission itself in its pharma strategy and in the Inception impact assessment as one of the key objectives of this revision. And some member states also support this goal. And fourth, the EU should champion strong transparency norms in the framework of the proposed WHO pandemic accord. And finally, our third set of recommendations aim to ensure that public interest remains the priority in all of the agreements. And for that, we propose that first, the new European Health Emergency and Preparedness and Response Authority, so HERA, who is now in charge of preventing, detecting, and responding to health emergencies, abides by high standards of transparency and accountability, that discloses timely, in a timely manner, all documents related to this work. HERA should ensure that there is meaningful consultation with all relevant stakeholders. And while it should take into account a wide variety of interests, it must ensure that public interest remains the ultimate priority. Second, the burden of proof demanded under Article 4 of the Transparency Regulation should be reversed, with companies being required to prove that withheld information would actually damage their commercial interests. And lastly, in case of a conflict arising between an exception provided under Article 4 of the Transparency Regulation and the overriding public interests should prevail. So the COVID committee is currently working on a report with lessons learned from the pandemic and key recommendations for the future. We have seen that changes are needed to ensure that we do not repeat the same mistakes again. And we hope to see some concrete measures being put forward. So thank you again for listening to our presentations. I will now give the floor to my colleague, Rowan, who will moderate a panel with our experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terita. So good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, once again, Terita, thank you for this overview of our recommendations. So my name is Rowan Dunn. I'm the EU Advocacy Coordinator for Global Health Advocates' Brussels office. And so I will be moderating this upcoming panel discussion. A couple of notes very quickly on housekeeping. So I would kindly ask our panelists to keep their camera on during the panel discussion, as well as during the Q&A, which will be following the panel discussion, and to please mute yourself if you do not have the floor. So on the panel today, I am joined by 3 knowledgeable experts on the topics of transparency, accountability, and access. So if I may start with Mr. Botenga. So Marc Botenga is a left member of the European Parliament who belongs to the Workers' Party of Belgium. And before his term as MEP, he was active in global health activism. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, he was a very strong advocate and campaigner in favor of transparency in regard to vaccine procurements, the TRIPS waiver, the lifting of IP rights on health technologies in order to make vaccines a global public good, notably via the No Profit on the Pandemic campaign. Our second panelist is Dr. Olga Gurgula, who is a senior lecturer in IP law at Brunel University in London. She has served as an expert consultant for international organizations, as well as governments and non-governmental organizations, mainly in the fields of IP and access to medicines. Dr. Gurgula is the author of many articles, so as I mentioned, including on IP and public health, strategic patenting by pharma companies, and compulsory licensing of trade secrets to enhance access to COVID-19 vaccines. And last but absolutely not least, we are joined by Dimitri Eynikel from Médecins Sans Frontières. And Dimitri is a policy advisor of Médecins Sans Frontières' Access Campaign and representative to the European Union. He co-coordinated the policy department of the MSF Access Campaign in the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I would like to thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you. I see we have a lot of people joining us online, which is fantastic. So if I could start with you, Mr. Botenga. So as a member of the European Parliament's COBE committee, you've been hearing many different stakeholders' views on how the EU actually responded to the COVID-19 crisis. Would you share our view, which we present in a report, that there was a certain inconsistency between the European Commission's word and its actions? And a follow-up to that question, what role would you think the pharma industry played in shaping EU decision-making during the pandemic?
Thank you for the invitation and for the event and for the two studies. I think they're all very to the point and timely. So congratulations. I think the report, and this is the first point which is important, contradicts actually the official narrative currently used by the European Commission, which is a narrative saying that the vaccine campaign and the vaccine strategy was by and large a success. I think it's important for us to contradict that, to say, listen, from a global health perspective, you know, the EU vaccine strategy was actually not a success in that it impeded rapid vaccine access for a number of countries in the global south. Because once you accept, and this was basically accepted at the very start of the negotiations, once you accept that intellectual property rights will stay uniquely, completely, totally in the hands of the companies, even when vaccines have been developed with a lot of technology that was funded and sometimes almost completely with public money, well, then you give the right to these companies to decide basically how much of the vaccine will be produced, where it will be produced, what price it will be sold eventually, and so on. So as soon as the EU accepted this and basically renounced to refuse to impose anything strong in that matter on pharmaceutical companies, it accepted that there was going to be shortages, I can do this, and many more than strictly necessary. I mean, it was going to be inevitable in the beginning, but I mean, that we were not going to have as many vaccines as quickly as possible as we could have had. And just to make it to make it clear, there were alternatives. You know, the World Health Organization put up very quickly a coronavirus COVID technology access pool, the CTAP, with the idea of sharing technologies, intellectual property rights, in order to get into a more global, collaborative, cooperative spirit in the development and the sharing of these health technologies. And even at later stages, you know, there was the TRIPS waiver debate, you referred to it, which was very important, and where as well the European Commission specifically played a very negative role. While the European Parliament, in the end, thanks to the campaign and the pressure from different organizations, from people's movement and so on, this was really important. We succeeded actually in tilting the balance inside Parliament, but the Commission stayed and continued to basically oppose the TRIPS waiver. Now, the question is, why did the EU act this way? And this is where I fully share your message that unfortunately, EU pharmaceutical policy throughout the years has often been very strongly influenced and sometimes driven by big pharma interests and by profit interests. Now, this is generally expressed in health documents by saying that we are worried about the competitiveness of the companies. And that becomes a euphemism to say that we are worried about the profits of the companies. And there's a connection here between what happened during the COVID pandemic and what happened before. Because even before, the EU saw these big pharma companies as partners. And they were even allowed to decide sometimes on the allocation of public funds, like in the case of the Innovative Medicines Initiative. But there's a fundamental difference of interest between, on the one hand, a private company attempting to make profits and public authorities attempting to get the best drugs out there at the most accessible way for all. So unless we acknowledge this contradiction in interests very often, and that we are, you know, perhaps you need to negotiate, but it's a negotiation with another counterpart that has different interests. Unless we accept that, unless we acknowledge that, we'll be making the same mistakes over and over again. So I'll leave it there for my first answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Botenga. Before turning to the next question, I just wanted to say that you are, of course, anyone in the audience is, of course, welcome to send in questions. We will be taking some shortly after the panel discussion. I see we are receiving some already. But yeah, once again, many thanks for your insight, Mr. Botenga. Next, we'll be hearing from Mr. Dimitri Eynikel from Médecins Sans Frontières. So yeah, if I can turn to you now. We argue in our report that it was mainly, commercial, economic, and also geopolitical considerations that helped shape the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than actual global public health considerations, and that Big Pharma actually played quite a leading role in shaping EU decision-making. So I was wondering, how would you describe the power dynamics which played out between the pharmaceutical industry and the European Commission, EU member states, and the European Parliament, and how, in your opinion, did these dynamics impact the global response to COVID-19?
Yeah, also from my side, first of all, thank you for the invitation and for the excellent reports. It's good research, and it's good to document what has happened so we can draw the right lessons learned, which is the end what we all want to achieve. From our organization, we have indeed been, with MSF, being quite strongly involved in advocating on better global access throughout the pandemic until today. And so we followed this closely. And so I will speak a bit from that. I will make a few additions to what has been said already, rather than repeat to what has been said. So first, I want to say that, there was a precedent to this inequity that we observed in 2005 with the H1N1 outbreak, where Tamiflu was being hoarded by Western countries. We could have known, and actually, the important stakeholders, the Commission, the Council, etc., they all could have known or knew that this could happen. There was even a letter in March 2020, which is just a few weeks after the outbreak in Italy, asking the Commission to use public funding for non-exclusive licenses of COVID-19 vaccines, medicines, etc., already at that time, which is super soon, actually, if you think about it, in a pandemic, making the case that there's going to be scarcity, there's going to be problems, you need to address them, and if not, it's gross negligence. That's what the letter said. Now, after that, in May, indeed, we had these, very generous comments about global public good. The vaccines are going to be global public good. But then I think something interesting happened that we sometimes overlook. And that's some comments that were made by the CEO of Sanofi that said, well, look, there's generous support from BARDA. So we are actually thinking about giving priority access to the United States to our vaccines. At the same time, we saw the United States buying up the supply of remdesivir, Gilead, which was seen as a promising treatment. And this is where I think the factor of fear, the fear of missing out in a situation of scarcity, was starting to drive the discussions and the negotiations and the power balance between the industry and the Commission and the member states. Rather than tackling the scarcity, there was going along with the scarcity and making sure that at least we get our part of the pie, so to say. And this is really what enabled the industry, in my opinion, in terms of setting these provisions on liability, transparency, intellectual property rights, and moving away from the commitments, which were quite positive in May, towards a vaccine strategy that in the end said, we will produce vaccines for Europe and we will export them to the rest of the world. And the only requirement we make to the industry is a moral commitment, which is worthless, to be honest, a moral commitment to supply low and middle income countries. So there was no accountability there at all anymore to have a global pandemic response in that regard. And this was all before the TRIPS waiver was tabled in October. Already all the elements was there. There were already calls for sharing of technology, there were already calls for sharing of IP rights, etc., but were starting to be ignored. And from that moment on, what I found quite peculiar is that the Commission in particular, and afterwards also the member states, increasingly seem to self-identify with the interest of the industry. They repeated a lot of the narrative that IP is not a problem, that we're better placed, that it's not possible to produce vaccines outside Europe, etc. All these arguments are often repeated. Even the element that the EU is exporting vaccines, to some extent is questionable. The EU doesn't export vaccines. The EU allowed the exportation of vaccines, but it was companies who exported the vaccines according to their commercial interests. The first vaccines were exported, the first batches were largely exported from the EU to Canada, Australia, United States, etc., which had some level of supply at the detriment of low and middle income countries, which you could really see the commercial agenda driving really the exports. So just to say that there's a problem there of taking distance from an industry which has completely different interests than what we expect from our governments, from the Commission, etc., in terms of a public health response. And I think that distance actually should be reinstalled to some extent and recreated. And I'm hopeful with a number of initiatives that are on the agenda right now that can happen. But that was certainly a major problem. And I think the interesting part is, as Mr. Botenga also outlined, is the position of Parliament. Parliament was, the industry had far less leverage over Parliament. They couldn't threaten with jobs or growth or no access to vaccines. I mean, they could threaten that, but in the end, they're not the final decision makers. So Parliament took a decision to really look at all the arguments carefully, and it had a far more nuanced response and positioning on a lot of these topics, because the lobby machine didn't work. The threats wouldn't work, or worked less effectively compared to, for example, the council or the Commission, which had real decision-making power when it comes to contracts and access to vaccines.
Thank you very much. I think I think we'd all agree these are very, very valid points, Mr. Eynikel. Indeed, one topic which comes up quite often, which I think you mentioned a few moments ago, is that of IP rights. And for this, I'd like to move on to our third speaker, who I think would all agree is a true expert in the matter, Dr. Gurgula. So in our analysis, we found that policymakers really seem to believe that the current IP system is adequate and that it works well, and they uphold the industry's belief in many ways that strong IP rules are necessary to protect innovation. And so we were just wondering, as an expert in IP law, what do you believe are other aspects which policymakers should take into consideration?
Thank you, Rowan, very much first of all, for inviting me, and congratulations on this very comprehensive report. Answering your question, well, our IP system was designed during normal times, and it's supposed to provide a just balance between incentives to innovate and, well, in our case, to pharma companies, well, on the other hand, to provide timely access to affordable medicines. And although, as we know, the system has been increasingly criticized for being inadequate to provide access to life-saving medicines even before the pandemic. So now we have to rely on this ineffective system during such an incredible emergency as the current pandemic. And we can now see this pandemic has revealed that the system is not working. It is severely imbalanced, prioritizing the protection of pharma companies' private interest and revealing our enormous dependence on private companies. And one of the key reasons for this is very strong IP protection embedded in this system. And we can see the significant lobby of pharmaceutical companies that even in such an emergency at international level, when millions of people were dying every day, we were not able to break the strong IP protection and implement the IP waiver, which could have saved millions of lives. And the first report discusses this problem. You discuss patents that provide protection to vaccines. I would also add a significant reliance of pharma companies on trade secrets, because vaccines are complex technologies. They are protected not only by patents, but also by trade secrets. And while we have some mechanism in IP law that could potentially help with accessing patent protected products without the patent owner's permission in the form of compulsory licensing, there is no such mechanism in IP law that would help with trade secrets. So even if there is a potential political will on the part of governments to implement involuntary technology transfer, we wouldn't be able to do that because the legislation is inadequate. So the current system of medical innovation and access is completely inadequate for such emergencies as the current pandemic, and we essentially government are completely dependent and at the mercy of international cooperation. So we must reconsider the system. We need to be prepared for future pandemics better.
Fantastic, thank you. These are really some very, very interesting insights. If I can just come back to you for a moment, Mr. Botenga. So in our previous session, my colleague Charita presented an overview of recommendations, so developed by both Global Health Advocates and STOPAIDS. So from your point of view, which recommendations would you say are the most relevant at this point, and why?
Thank you. I like the most concrete ones the best, because they're the easiest, let's say, for us also to defend and to try to get into the final conclusions of the report. So that'll be a fight in any case, because, as you know, not everyone in Parliament agrees with these recommendations, unfortunately, or not yet. So let me first pick out maybe the absolute necessity to shorten the regulatory protection periods. I think this is really important. There's a push from industry to strengthen IP. It's a continuous push, be it by supplementary protection certificates, be it by extending the protection of other offered by other tools. So I think this is really important. We have a strong argument as well regarding the innovation model. The strengthening of IP has not led to a better innovation model. If you look at the amount of new, really innovative medicines we get for public money, and you compare it to, let's say, the 50s, it's not like you can claim that intellectual property right has been this great at guaranteeing an innovation. Moreover, companies like to claim that they need these big profits they're making in order to reinvest in research and development. Now, we all know that profits very often go somewhere else, be it in advertisement, be it in dividends, share buybacks, and so on. So I also think that making public funding conditional on public access clauses is absolutely fundamental. You're using public money, put the conditions. I'm not going to comment on transparency. I'm very much in favor. I think the current scandal ongoing in the European Parliament proves that we need as much transparency as we can get. And unfortunately, I don't think HERA is currently as transparent and as accountable as it should be, far from that. So we need to do this. And it's all the more important because, unfortunately, the European Commission is using the model of negotiations with Big Pharma as a model for other negotiations. For example, the joint purchases on energy now, they're kind of taking the model of the vaccine purchase negotiations as an example, which is obviously not the way we want to go. So that's important. And maybe if you allow me, I'll try to add one, which I would have, which I think is important. Because it's been lined out also, I think, by Dimitri Eynikel, and the leverage these companies had is also linked to the fact that they very often have almost a monopoly, or if not a monopoly, on drug development or on drug production. And so I do think, and this is a report that has been presented to the scientific panel of the Parliament recently, that we need a public infrastructure. We need to start thinking about a public infrastructure for research development, perhaps even the production of certain essential medicines, in order to make sure that, you know, the opposite happens. You said, what happens when Big Pharma is making the law, is driving? Well, let's make sure that the public interest, public health is controlling, is setting the agenda. And therefore, I think considering and developing a public health infrastructure, as in really public or non-for-profit biotech initiatives whatsoever, I think that could be a really good recommendation I also would like to see in the Covey report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Botenga, for these very interesting insights. Duly noted for your last recommendation. And now, if I can move on to you, back to you again, Mr. Eynikel, with a similar question. Which recommendations, in your opinion, are the most timely? In perhaps just a couple of sentences.
Okay, well, there are three that really stand out for me. One, and I will briefly discuss them. The first one is with regards to the regulation on access to documents of the EU. I think there's really indeed a problem there. You know, in a way, it's kind of almost ironic that you know, there needs to be an overriding public interest, but in the regulation, it's not defined. So it's the Commission itself that has access to documents that defines whether there is an overriding public interest or not. We as the public don't know if we have an overriding public interest because it's not defined. So there's a problem there that regulation needs to be addressed. Now that's specifically on the one of on access to documents. The other two are more generally about transparency in the pharmaceutical system, on prices, R&D, etc. We really need an implementation of the WHO Transparency Resolution of 2019, which has been agreed upon, but nobody implements it in full. The second one is on access conditions to research and development for the reasons that Mr. Botenga has described. But on that point, it's true that there is some movement in the European Commission with the pharmaceutical strategy, but it's very much led by the health department when it comes to market approval. A lot of the leverage is not there. It's much earlier in the development process. It's the research and development department, it's the economic growth department, the trade department, etc. They have a lot of leverage over some of these files. But unfortunately, it's all tasked upon the health department to solve some of the imbalances of power at the very end when the product enters the market, which is too late. So we really need to have buy-in and a shift of positioning across the Commission, in my opinion. And this is a bit going back to the points that have been raised earlier, that the industry is seen as a partner because of historic and economic reasons. And we really need to see this as an industry that needs to be properly regulated in the public interest.
Thank you very much. Again, excellent insights. And yeah, if I can come back to you, Dr. Gurgula. So in our analysis of the EU framework for access to documents, what we found is that it can be quite hard to challenge the redactions because the applicant requesting access is the one who needs to provide the specific circumstances for disclosure, without at the same time having access to the actual documents. So one of our recommendations is to reverse this burden of proof. So basically, European Commission or third parties requesting documents to be redacted would need to show exactly how access to that document could specifically and actually undermine the interest protected by that exception. What do you think of this recommendation?
Well, I completely agree. It's difficult not to agree with this recommendation. So the basic presumption is that all documents held by European institutions are public unless there is an exception, and commercial interest is an exception, right? So unless there is overriding public interest. And it was very interesting to see that the report essentially, analyzing the court decisions, revealed that the courts have placed the burden of identifying the specific circumstances that establish the public interest on applicants requesting access. And this is really a heavy burden because they do not have access to the documents. And of course, it is difficult to provide such evidence, such specific evidence. So I completely agree, the burden must be on the public body who is in possession of the documents and have the possibility to evaluate such interests. Moreover, I think that the reliance on the most important principles of government bodies, such as openness and transparency, as well as accountability for spending public money, especially in times of emergencies, such as the current pandemic, should be enough to satisfy this burden for the applicant. So yes, absolutely, it is the government authority that must conduct the balancing exercise when considering whether to provide access to a specific document or not.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think we can now move to the Q&A session. I see we already have some interesting answers coming in from the audience in a couple of different channels. I see we have a question here for you, Mr. Botenga. So the question is, these are quite relevant and timely recommendations, and having the support of the European Parliament is absolutely crucial to make them a reality. Do you foresee that the Parliament as a whole will support them, and what can be done to ensure they are taken forward?
I think Parliament is a political entity. Let's make this clear. So whatever happens in Parliament has to do with pressure, with mobilization from civil society, from people. Because I also think, I mean, when we started discussing intellectual property rights and, for example, the TRIPS waiver in Parliament, there was no majority for them. For it at all. It was even like people were looking at us that were like, what are you talking about? Why is this going to be an issue? Although it was foreseeable. But over time, because of the mobilizations, because of the pressure that was exerted by, as I said, civil society organizations, some MEPs got better information, so that was important. Some MEPs were like, okay, no, indeed, there is a public health emergency. We need to act, and if this is an obstacle, then we need to take away the obstacle. So I'm always optimistic. I've always been, and I think we can include these, but it will require pressure, and it will require mobilization, advocacy on behalf of course, of ourselves, of the members of parliament, the politicians that are supporting this cause. But on the other hand, also and especially from civil society organizations and the global, let's say, the global health movement as such.
Okay, thank you. We have another question come in just now. I'm afraid it doesn't say who it is for, so I'm guessing it's probably either for you, Mr. Eynikel, or for Dr. Gurgula. So contractual secrecy is a collective action problem. Governments keep some information secret because they believe that they are being offered better terms that might not be available to them if the information was known to others, such as a price discount, for example. What would happen if everyone was required to publish contractual information? And do you see the pandemic accord as an opportunity to promote contractual secrecy? I'm not sure who wants to take this. I see you've unmuted yourself, Dr. Gurgula.
It's a very good question, and we can see the same issue, the same problem we've identified in the UK as well, when UK government relied on trade secret law and redacted all the important contractual elements when they were procuring contracts, relying also on commercial interests. And that we need to understand that this has impacted not only the negotiations here in the UK, but also how the information, the lack of information in other countries affected the negotiations in their jurisdictions. Ending up with developing countries paying very high price for vaccines, higher than in the UK and the European Union. So I think that the idea of disclosing information, such information as, well, it's not a commercial, it's not a manufacturing process that the company should protect, right? So the price of a vaccine should not be a secret. And this will help both inside the country in terms of how the government spends the public fund, but also it will help other countries to negotiate fair pricing. And I think that in your reports, this is something that has been highlighted very clearly.
Can I answer this question as well?
Of course,
Briefly.
Go ahead.
Well, the only reason that these prices are secret, as Dr. Gurgula briefly mentioned as well, is because it's the interest of industry. There's no public interest in keeping the secrets. The public sector is not asking for this, it's the private sector. And I've done a bit of research about the prices of medicines, the real net prices of medicines in Europe. And I came across that some of the prices were highest in Portugal and Poland, and they were the least expensive in the UK and Switzerland, which doesn't make any sense if you think about GDP per capita. It should be the other way around. And this shows you exactly why there is no price transparency, because it enables unfair pricing practices. So our opinion is quite clearly that, transparency will enable more fair negotiations, fair prices, fair conditions, etc., to be negotiated in the interest within Europe, but largely within the interest on a global level as well beyond Europe.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's true that it is one thing which we talk about in the reports, is that unlike in the EU, so for example, if you look at the COVID-19 contracts, which was signed with the American government or with the British government, the prices there were actually public, and it doesn't seem to have damaged the industry's commercial interest in those countries. I see we have another question that has come in, so for Tarita on the first report which you presented, regarding who actually carries out the contract negotiations and whether the information is public.
Hi, Ron. So thank you. So who carries out the negotiations? The Commission, together with a joint negotiating team, carries out the negotiations for the vaccines with the suppliers. So the members of the negotiating team are appointed by a steering committee. They are representative of 7 member states. So France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So Italy, Netherlands, and Spain, they have confirmed their envoy to journalists, but the Commission has declined to share the list of the negotiators officially. In fact, one of the documents that were requested in the Freedom of Information request that was required for the Commission it was indeed to disclose this negotiating team list. And the Ombudsman investigation that led to the heavily redacted contracts being disclosed also came together with a promise from the Commission to consider making over 300 documents related to the negotiations available. So after this promise, the inquiry was closed, but promises were unfulfilled because we still don't have access to most of these documents, even redacted versions of them. So the Ombudsman reopened this investigation and asked the Commission to share how they have fulfilled their promise to review these documents and gave them mid-January as a deadline. We have contact Corporate Europe's Observatory just before finalizing the reports. And as of the beginning of this month, they had received no update on this matter.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We have one more question that has come in for Mr. Botenga. I realize that you have to go in a couple of minutes. So I hope you can take one final question. It's a very, shall we say, it's very linked to the current events happening here in Brussels. Are you confident with the fact that the Pfizer CEO will finally agree to meet MEPs? So probably, I'm guessing, within the COVID committee.
Yes, I get that question because I said I was always optimistic, but no, on this one I am not. He has shown an absolute lack of respect for transparency in general, and lack of respect also for the European Parliament. The bigger issue here, I think, is, and this has been pointed out by the EU Court of Auditors and by the Ombudsman, is obviously that he doesn't need to because he's got a direct link to the chairwoman of the European Commission. Even through WhatsApp messages, it's also mentioned in the report, which is an absolute scandal from a transparency and a democratic accountability perspective. You cannot have this kind of negotiations being dealt, even small part of it, because Pfizer, spokesperson of Pfizer told us, yes, but obviously these negotiations are too complex to be dealt with through WhatsApp message. So don't worry, there's nothing to worry about. But obviously we all know that these messages, there might be a small clause in the messages, or it's a friendly message that does mix up interest. There's a conflict of interest there, which is very clear. So no, I am not confident. I am hopeful though, and in order to end on an optimistic note, that this entire scandal we currently have, which does show that there's a big problem with the culture, let's say, of money within the European institutions and the European Parliament, that we can use this hopefully as leverage to burst open the bubble a little bit and to make sure that we get the transparency and the democratic accountability that we do deserve and that people deserve when vaccines are bought with their money.
Absolutely. I think that's a very strong note to end on your side. I understand that you have to leave now, but thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you and to have your insights. We have I think we have time for one final question, which is for Mr. Eynikel. So why was the 2019 World Health Assembly resolution on transparency in the pharmaceutical relations with governments unanimously agreed upon at the WHO only a few months before COVID-19 started, completely disregarded and ignored later on?
It's a good question. I think it's better to ask your local government or your national government, basically, why that's the case than me. One caveat, it was adopted with three countries that opted out, and it was Germany, Hungary, and I think the UK actually opted out from binding themselves to these commitments. But well, actually, I say binding, but it's actually a non-binding resolution. So it's a more general commitment to work towards these goals. I think there was one or two countries at least that made some progress. Italy and France, in particular, there was some progress. But on a more general level, it's just, when it comes, the imbalances in power that we discuss here today are exactly the problem, right? When it comes to implementing commitments about transparency, etc., this is when you get the pushback, when it has to be put into a particular law that has to go to government, has to go through parliament, has to be voted on, etc. And this is where the lobby machine kicks in and things start to get very complicated to move forward. In addition, the second factor, and maybe an even more important factor, is again this fear of missing out, if I would put it this way. Countries are still hesitant to move forward with transparency, kind of avoiding the confidentiality clauses and then facing a higher price. They're afraid of the repercussion that it could have on them and their access to the products that they need. And this is where there's really a need to build mutual trust in a way, because if all countries or many countries, let's say in the European Union or even on a more global level, start to work together and have this commitment already and start to implement it at the same time, you take away this fear, because this is when the potential negative consequences of being the only one that's being transparent is taken away. So you need to build on this trust, and you really need to work on a concrete frame of implementation, in my opinion, to really move it up significantly, even if there are, good steps taken in a number of countries.
Fantastic. Thank you for your answer. I think just to bounce back very briefly on the question of trust, as we have seen, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, public has been losing trust in governments and in the vaccines as well. We are seeing more and more vaccine hesitancy, which is certainly, in my opinion, not being helped by the fact that there's been so much secrecy about around the contract negotiations and everything which has happened later on. Pfizer refusing to answer questions. It's certainly not helping things. But thank you very much to everyone for submitting your questions, and a very special thank you to our three panelists for making yourselves available today to share your insights and your expertise. I think we can all agree it was a very interesting discussion. I will now hand over back to James Cole from STOPAIDS for a couple of closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rowan, and thank you so much, Mr. Botenga, Mr. Eynikel, and Dr. Gurgula, for the really insightful discussion and reflections as well, team. Only got a few minutes, but I think I could spend many hours more discussing the insights that you shared today as well, team. But just for a few short reflections, I think the panel highlighted how we did have an alternative. Whether that was a COVID-19 technology access pool, whether that was the TRIPS waiver, or just fighting for transparency, we could have avoided some really car crash decisions and expanded vaccine access globally as well. And we also knew our history. This wasn't the first pandemic, it won't be the last pandemic. And we need to learn, whether it's from HIV, whether it's from COVID, about the policy and legal tools we can use to prioritize public health. The discussions also highlighted the cross-international challenges that we're all facing. For myself, being in one of the 3 countries that actually didn't endorse the transparency resolution, being the UK, we too see too clearly in the UK as well the level of pharmaceutical influence and the fundamental lack of transparency. And the reports that we're launching today align really well to the other pieces of research that STOPAIDS will be reporting on over the coming months as well too. And from Mr. Botenga's points, completely agree on the need for civil society and community mobilization and advocacy, and hopefully the reports will feed in to support that work going forwards. So ultimately, the reports we're launching today have highlighted how a lack of transparency and industry influence meant it was difficult to assess whether the Commission was failing to meet its objective to promote global vaccine access until it was too late. Lives were lost, variants emerged, but contractual secrecy was preserved. And we found that pharmaceutical companies steered the direction of the EU's COVID-19 response. This was despite there being huge public funding for the development of COVID-19 health technologies. The same mistakes cannot be repeated again. Ensuring access, transparency, and accountability will be fundamental for bettering the Commission's pandemic response. We hope our research and the key recommendations put forward today will support decision makers to take the necessary action to promote transparency and protect public health and democratic spaces. The reports are now available on both STOPAIDS and Global Health Advocates websites. and we officially released tomorrow. Please do read the full reports and share across your colleagues and networks. And if you can turn to the next slide that has myself and Rowan's details, please do reach out to us if you had any questions about the reports or if you wanted to discuss the recommendations further, including for any requests from journalists. And we very much look forward to continuing to work with colleagues to drive forward the report series recommendations. So I would like to close by thanking everyone who joined today's webinar. And of course, again, our expert panelists of MEP Marc Botenga, Dimitri Eynikel, and Dr Olga Gurgula. I'd also like to thank again journalist Priti Pupnik and a legal researcher for supporting writing the reports, and everyone who was interviewed by us as well. And finally, I'd like to thank again the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust for making this research possible. And thanks again for everyone for joining today.